Thank you very much, Keely. I'd start by, again, acknowledging the Indigenous people who were custodians of this land for millennia. But I'd also like, and I always do this, acknowledge the very special role we have as people involved in healthcare, in closing the gap and encouraging healing, fixing whatever broke. And that happens on a day-to-day basis in the First Nations people we see. I have the privilege of working with one at the moment, a young doctor, and we have opportunities, both small and great, to make a difference that we may never see the outcomes of that work. That's part of leadership. Jala wasn't the warm-up act. She just had to get home early, I think. And I would say that when people put this together, they didn't know that Jala and I have been friends for 35 years. We got to know each other as uni students in Trades Hall in Lygon Street back in the late 80s, actually. I was probably the only medical student who mixed in that crowd. But it's funny where you establish relationships, and relationships are the essence of what we do. I better put my glasses on because I can't see. I'm not sure, I can't remember where the title came from. It may have been Grace, and I take the opportunity to thank all the organisers. I won't name you because it's not fair to leave out people, but to say that initiative, creativity and a bit of courage in starting something new is always a bit of a challenge. And I hope that we start this off in the right way and that it grows from strength to strength and does good. Collaborative leadership, I see irony all the time these days. I am sometimes seen as a troublemaker. But I hope that one of the strengths I recognise is when teams work well, in a resus bay, in a professional context, when adversaries come together respectfully to bring a best outcome, either in a justice context, in a legislative context. These are the things that get good outcomes. And there are tools that you can use to facilitate those or impair them. Bold decisions. I think it all comes down to authenticity. Be yourself. I don't see what I do as particularly courageous. I'm just being myself. And I think if you follow that dictum with the humility to learn when your strengths, which are often your weaknesses at the very same time, can lead to mistakes, or you can listen, then authenticity... What's going on tonight? Sounds like ED. Code grey. Then that authenticity will take you a long way, and it will hopefully lead you to avoid some of the pitfalls that we all experience, but hopefully you can experience them as infrequently as possible. We are all the product of our personal experience. There's 3 photos there that mean something to me. The top one is emergency at one of my emergency departments, St Vincent's. And I can say it tonight with pride and without worrying that it's the name of one of my hospitals will get into the media and cause all sorts of grief for my bosses. Good evening, Nicole. That was the day of the thunderstorm asthma event in November 2016. Now, ED is a pretty chaotic place, but that day was just unbelievable. I use that example, one, because it's one of the few pictures I have that can get away with saying it's relatively de-identified. But it also says something about how busy things were. And people that day were working in an incredible way. They had to make it up as they went. We were short on many resources. The leadership exhibited by one of my colleagues, Neil is his name, and the senior nurses, what we call SSAs or orderlies or attendants, it was an incredible team effort. And that was one day with the aftermath, and then who saw the pandemic coming? So that team, that place, that has become a home for me over many, many years. The second one, that was me looking like the boss, but I was actually the vice president. I like that photo with a guy named Professor Brian Owler, who's a neurosurgeon. I got to do a lot because Brian did 16-hour extravaganzas in theatre when he was federal president of the AMA, and so I would be the next person, and I had some opportunities because I was rarely scrubbed, and I'd use those, and we were a good team. But that was a place where experience, I hadn't expected or intended to take a leadership role through the AMA, but it happened, and I'm proud of the skills that I learnt there, and I noted at the bottom of that slide only recently that it was a commentary about palliative care, which became something that is incredibly important to me, even though you think emergency medicine might be a little bit removed from it. The bottom one, and I always get emotional about this was my late uncle Sonny. Sonny died of cholangiocarcinoma. He was a patient of Peter Mac. He had a Whipple's procedure, a major operation for those who don't know it. But unfortunately, the carcinoma recurred. And that was with his grandson, who's now a teenage boy. And I was so profoundly affected by the palliative care experience of my uncle. And I vowed that I would do everything I could to advocate for that sort of service to be available to people, not just those who were related to doctors. And I'm a proud West Sunshine boy, so I am very much determined that social justice animates everything that I do. And I'm 53 and it matters more to me now than it did when I was a kid. Those experiences are ones that I have found. I actively sought the opportunity to be a doctor and I trained for that. The experiences have given me skills as a public speaker, as understanding media, understanding the political system, and personal experience, not just as a doctor, but as a relative and as a patient, have taught me things and values that I would not otherwise gain. The balance between pragmatism and principle. When do you use flexibility? A bit like the thunderstorm asthma time. And when do you stick to principle even if a tidal wave is going to run you over and you know it's going to run you over? That's the balance that you always need to try and find and that I find myself thinking of. These are some posts I put in social media over some of those worst days of the pandemic, and I say the pandemic is not over, even though we want it to be, even though we are as a community heavily traumatised by that experience. The race to prepare, the fact that we saw, again, a tidal wave coming towards us, seeing advanced, highly resourced medical systems pushed over. I remember the images and advice coming from emergency colleagues in New York City and Bergamo in northern Italy, seeing people hypoxic sitting on park benches out the front. That scared the crap out of me. And knowing it was coming and wondering how to deal with it, it was a race. Knowing that resources were not necessarily going to be available, that expertise was not available. Seeing people sitting there happily with oxygen saturation levels in the 60s, the happy hypoxics, and knowing that our tools to confront that were limited and that the risks to each of us were significant. And we do what we do, prepare as clinicians. I was one of the very first doctors in Australia who had to do 2 weeks of isolation. Almost all of us would have had to do that over the last few years, but back in March 2020, that was a novel thing. And I made a comment about it, and goodness me, it got picked up by the media. And I thought, well, let's talk about these things as an experience that might be of some value to other people who are going through them themselves. I found those 2 weeks incredibly isolating. Sent the kids away to stay with relatives. I was in my home and used that time to try and learn everything I could about what I could do when I got back, learning the novelty of online meetings. And then there are just a few of these examples. I'd take it upon myself to comment on the Premier's comments sometimes. I disapproved of doing 100 days in a row because we know that exhausted leaders are not very good leaders. Of supporting measures that were hard. We all have had to make real sacrifices there. But I'm not an epidemiologist. I just wanted people to understand that their restriction to 5 kilometre zones might reduce the number of people or families that I had to walk through a dying process. And as Jala said, I'll never forget those stories that I had of holding a tablet with their dying relative, often a frail elderly person, and their family couldn't be with them. And it was like that. So helping people understand why they were making sacrifices, not wanting to belittle the sacrifices, the trauma that we are indeed all recovering from. And then trying to lead by personal example as well. That was me getting the first vaccine in March 21, I think, and I was very happy to be in the front row of that one. But just trying to say to people that simple measures, we talk about, for example, the relative recency of mRNA vaccination. But the principles of vaccination have been around since the late 18th century, and they still hold true. They are not perfect, but their impact on mortality and morbidity is profound. Now, that might sound like basic stuff to everyone in this room, but it's so scary and sad, isn't it, that in our society these days things get caught up in a maelstrom of politics and paranoia and ignorance. And you know, the fact that the Chief Health Officer of this state or the eminent head of an institute like the Doherty Institute is subject to personal attack and really vicious attack for speaking up on things that are really non-contentious from a science point of view. So that's my summary. Race to prepare, work out the urgency of things. And in emergency, we are, I think, expert at working out when we've got time and when we don't. Doing what we can with the resources that we've got. Collaborating, drawing people in. There's an enormous amount that I have no expertise in. And leading by example. Talk's cheap. So when you can do it, it packs a punch. And the most influential leaders in my upbringing have been the ones who've led by example. The power of the personal story. I think there are some images there that I think are really striking to me. The child learning from home. My youngest daughter is 15 and she is suffering severe anxiety. It's not the only reason, but 2 years at home in year 7 and 8 has had an influence on that, and that is one of the byproducts of the lockdown, which we experienced in Australia to the greatest degree here in Victoria. Respecting, acknowledging that, and working out what we have to do to help healing is an important part. Those queues outside of social security, outside of the Centrelink offices. You know, many of us in healthcare had guaranteed jobs, always will potentially, and Many people could work from home. A lot of people lost their livelihoods. A lot of people could not work from home and travel. And it was no surprise that the north and west of Melbourne were the worst hit. I was at Werribee Mercy for the time of the worst of the pandemic, and it had the highest per capita rates of COVID in Victoria. And that's because many of them were transitory workers who travelled, who did face-to-face things with their hands. And of course, the elderly, the frail. If any of you are looking at my Facebook, or not Facebook, Twitter, I make that note that the ultimate marker of decency is how we treat our frail and vulnerable. And that's the test for me. And again, so many of you do that. The last was a personal example where I only with a lot of patience and gentle cajoling by my wife, who's also a doctor, by my colleagues, by my doctor, realised that I had burned out last year. It was predictable. I am my own worst enemy. I have trouble saying no. There have been many harsh critics I've had in my career. 30 years of medicine. Medicine's culture has changed a lot, but none of them came close to the harshest criticism that I got when I looked in the mirror. And I still do to some stage, but I hope that my experience and capacity help me understand those limitations a little bit better. So if I can take the edge off that criticism, it helps. And I think that if you do that, you're halfway home to really exploring your full potential. I never lose an opportunity for a teaching moment. I remember teaching anatomy at Melbourne Uni 20 years ago, and one of the students fainted. And she lay down on the ground, got her down there, lifted up the legs and said, a bit of auto-transfusion. Let's talk a little bit about circulation and the autonomic nervous system and things like that. I thought that talking about my need for time off, and I hadn't had 3 months off in 28 years, the impact that these things had on me, and doing it in a way that required a lot of experience so that I didn't say the wrong thing, would give other people a chance to pause for thought. If someone at Steve's level of seniority could admit to this, then maybe I need to practice a little bit more self-care. And over the course of my career, I have lost probably 8 to 9 colleagues that I can think of to suicide. I don't want to conflate too many issues, but doctors in particular we have our strengths and we have our flaws. And recognising our flaws as well as our strengths is an important part of being good, safe, fulfilled doctors and human beings. Without realising it, I've been a doctor for 31 years, and I get a laugh when I say to the junior doctors, I'm PGY 31. They teach me so much, and I say to them, I try, and I don't get it right all the time, I try to look after you because there's a pretty good chance that some of you are going to be looking after me if I make it to that age. Because some of those very senior people have now been my patients. And that, what goes around comes around. And in medicine and nursing and all the healthcare professions, vocations I call them, we have a rare privilege to do that. Jala talked about it earlier, confidence versus imposter syndrome. It's funny the things that we're confident about and the things that make us wet ourselves, the code brown. I don't have any problem about talking in public. Why is that? What aspects of the personality do that? And I hope I'm old enough that the ego can be left to one side. But there are many things that scare me. Many things that scare me. And I automatically now think of the people beside me and around me as a way of building confidence. The resuscitation base still can be a place of real fear. but I look at the people who are in that team, who I'm often leading these days, and I try to imbue them with confidence and see what their best skills are and reassure. Hopefully a long way from the insecurities of a very junior consultant many years ago who would take out his insecurities on the people around him. And I'm not very proud of that. Perfection is the enemy of good. Of course we want the best outcomes for our patients, but perfection is not possible in this life. Perfect resourcing, perfect skills, no one, if they are honest, has all the answers. But knowing where to find those things is really important. And being gentle on oneself results in far better outcomes. So I remind myself of that. Again, I'm now at that stage in my career where it is my principal responsibility to encourage, to challenge, but to do so very carefully, and sometimes I'll get it wrong, and to mentor. And what does that term mentorship mean? And sometimes being a mentor is not about saying the popular stuff, but I learned from my father, who used to be a senior manager at Vic Roads, if you've got something negative to say to someone, do it in private. Take the loss of face aspect out of the equation. And if you have differences of opinion with someone, focus on the issue. There's a lovely term in Latin, ad hominem. Don't play the man, don't play the person. Focus on the issue. And again, you heard when Keely introduced me, I was one of the leaders of the case against voluntary assisted dying for a whole range of reasons. I took on that role reluctantly. I wasn't in a good place to be able to speak about those things, but I knew if I didn't, no one else would. I always sought, even in the face of some real hatred, to focus on the issues, to speak with compassion. And doctors and nurses have plenty of experience talking about sensitive, difficult subjects in a caring, difficult manner, and trying to put people at some ease, but at the very least getting them to think about things. So while it is difficult, I go to sleep well at night knowing that I did my best on that issue and still think that there are some issues that we continually need reminding of. This is another one that I think is important. The best leaders make themselves redundant. None of us are here forever. We are all tenants. And we want our children, we want our successors, our students, to be better than us. If you find that you are threatened by one of your juniors, for want of a better term, you're the one who needs to move on. Not them, you. Don't let your leadership be defined by insecurity. Keep an open mind and an open heart. If we are honest, we learn as much from our juniors as they do from us. And what we can offer changes over time. To use one example, I probably gave a lot more in the specifics of emergency medicine teaching when I was fresh out of the exams. I'm not the best ultrasonographer in emergency, but what I hope I can do is help recognise a colleague in distress, that I can help them find the balance on difficult ethical issues, that I can help them recognise risk. One of the things that I am never good at is accepting criticism. Again, the harsh critic. I continually need to keep working at that. But there's a word I'm getting better at, and that is I'm sorry, or I apologise. It is amazing how effectively you can move to the next step if you say that. You don't want it to be an empty term either. Sorry with contrition matters a great deal, and it builds relationships even if you're not at fault. We know that. Open disclosure, candour, and that removes so much of the angst from a person who has suffered an adverse event. Another term I will say, whether it's an adverse medical outcome, a natural disaster, the first question we should ask is not who is to blame. It is what can we do to make things better. Try not to take yourself too seriously. My son said on that one, and Mike Amer's a good friend of mine now, if I get the phone call at 4:45 and I'm still at the hospital, I'll duck across the road to the exhibition gardens, de-identified, cover the hospital badge on the scrubs, get a gown on or something, and do the interview on whatever it was in the day. That day I forgot to take the cap off, and I got home and my son said, "Dad, ninja." Ninja with glasses. Anyway, you've got to have a laugh. This is my last slide, the importance of gratitude. That's my family. My wife, who's a paediatric emergency physician, and the 5 children we share. I never deserved to have such joy, such happiness, such responsibility. But that's only one aspect of my life. My work, I don't get it right, but it is, and these are not throwaway lines, mean what you say. Understanding what we do makes it a bit easier to do the job. You should have permission to say sometimes, I don't have the energy, I don't have the drive. I'm not perfect. But if we consider who we work with, what we do, why we do it, that gives you plenty of reasons often to think about where you want to direct your energy, and that will change over time. What you want to do now and what you want to do in 5, 10 years may well look very different, and that's okay. That's okay. But reminding yourself about those incredible blessings that we have is, I think, one of the most powerful catalysts for making change. So I'll close on that by simply saying, be yourself. Find that balance between ego and humility. Keep an open mind and an open heart. Recognise that you're not machines, that we are all human beings, and that we can make great tangible changes, but many of the things that we do, we will never know, or someone might remind us about it in 10 or 20 years. Thanks for listening.